Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. I'm the head of Intermodal Solutions here at FreightWaves, Mike Bowdendistel. I'm joined by Joanna Marsh, whose house is under construction after a bit of a act of God. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. Okay, we are talking about it. Yeah, so about almost 3 weeks ago on a Saturday morning, it was a very nice day, blue skies, no wind, no rain, big, gigantic oak tree. Just decided it was done with its life and just fell like right on the house and and uh and yeah so right now if you hear footsteps throughout if you hear footsteps it's because uh the insurance hired contractors to move out the furniture. They actually haven't started on restoration of the roof and the
Mhm,
ceiling.
mhm.
So it's a very long process. As I'm sure some people are familiar with, unfortunately, for better for worse. So
Yeah, maybe it'll be good for rail volumes. We'll get some lumber on the railroad.
yeah, there you
So
go.
what so you've been writing all these articles, in the middle of this construction project. And I think one of them is really sort of topical today because we're going to be talking to Harris Ligon shortly, who's a co-founder of Telegraph. He does a lot with rail service. And so why don't you walk us through this first one about how the three of the class one rails have to keep giving service updates based on the STB's new service rules. I guess CSX is off the hook. Is that right?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, they're on off the hook in the sense I think they don't have to report. Sort of get in touch with the STB biweekly in terms of like how they're doing, but they are. Each of the railroads had set targets for themselves in terms of where they would like service to be in so many months. And CSX, for the most part, met its targets, but BNSF, Union Pacific, and Norfolk Southern haven't fully met their targets yet, which is why they have been told to continue to report biweekly to the STB about how things are going. And of course, that said, all four of them still are encouraged to report sort of the monthly headcount goals and see, what their
Mhm.
targets are and whether they've met them uh, since it's the SDB's belief that the rail count, I'm sorry, the head count, that there is a relationship between headcount and rail service. And so there's that. And then also, I think all four railroads still have to submit data on some other service metrics since, rail is kind of an interconnected network. So you have, there's
Mhm.
still some data like, first mile, last mile data that they're being required to submit. But yeah, I mean, CSX doesn't have to do the biweekly reports, but the other three still have to.
Yeah, and I guess there's some data suggests that Norfolk Southern's service is lagging the rest of the industry. You even have the sort of a chart on that with weekly intermodal speeds. It shows Norfolk Southern behind. Yeah, so this is trains holding per day, which shows Norfolk Southern still elevated, versus where they were sort of in their pre-pandemic levels. I guess some of that is employees. I think they talked about how a third of their locations, their employees still below suboptimal levels. Some of the other intermodal carriers have gotten a little bit better. BNSF have a similar chart on BNSF that shows that actually their number of trains holding per day seems like it's back down to a normalized level. Part of that's just lower volume coming in through the West Coast, but quite a bit easier when intermodal volume is down double digits. And then the weekly train speeds, I have a sonar chart on that, which shows Norfolk Southern is in purple, shows them lagging the rest of the industry on intermodal train speed. I mean, I think what might be related to that would be, that East Palestine, where now Norfolk Southern said that they're digging up, a lot of the soil underneath underneath the tracks there to make sure there wasn't any environmental contamination. So that's something to watch. And then you also put out an article on the rail suppliers, Trinity Industries, GATX, Wabtec. I used to follow those companies extremely closely. Don't follow them as closely anymore. Anything interesting you learned from the suppliers?
Yeah, I think that at least for Trinity and for GATX, you have this softer volume environment, but they're still kind of holding on to their outlook that there's still pent up demand. And if rail service continues to improve, that will only relieve that pent up demand even more. But regardless of the rate of rail service improvements, they still see that there's still a need and also a desire to use rail. So yeah, and both of them said that. And Wabtec, the comments I focused on more were sort of their technology products sort of in light of rail safety developments and how they're if and how they're working with customers to address some of the the detection systems, both like on the track and on the train as well. So so yeah, I mean they're both pretty interesting. I mean the three calls were pretty interesting.
So still a decent amount of tightness for rail cars. Is that right? By and large, because
Yeah,
the
yeah,
rail carload volume is still holding up.
yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think also, because of, partly because of the uncertain macro environment, partly because of inflation, I think people are still kind of holding on. Partly because new rail cars are expensive. Like people are still trying to hold on to what they have, and of course you have the retirements coming up for the box cars and perhaps some other cars too. So that's still on the horizon, and so I think it's trying to milk the assets of what you have before you have to go get some new rail cars.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so with that, I want to bring on today's guest, which is Harris Ligon, co-founder and CEO of Telegraph. This is a venture capital-based rail data and software OS company that works on predictive visibility. Do we have Harris with us? There he is.
Mike,
thanks for joining us.
Joanna,
good to see you again.
how we doing?
Doing great. Always good to see you.
Well, folks, I think to kind of kick it off, I think one of the things that Joanna was just talking about was kind of railcar availability, railcar tightness in the broader marketplace. One of the things that we have noticed in some of the data that we are collecting internally and some of the conversations we've had with customers and users is that it looks like if you're a user of leased rail cars and you survived the past 2 years, you are unlikely to go back to where you are a high user of railroad system cars. So I think the increase of wanting to use private cars is only going to continue for the next 5 to 10 years. And so Trinity, GATX, and other railcar leasing companies are only going to see the benefit of that long term. I think the bigger question for the railroads is going to be how are they going to handle, process, optimize, and distribute all of these empty rail cars that are not directly owned by them?
Because they don't have the motivation to do so. I mean, I guess there was all those issues with the embargoes on Union Pacific that, they were handling their own car, giving priority to their own cars versus the cars that were owned by the leasing companies. Have you seen that?
Yeah, Mike, I'm not sure if it's always a question of motivation with the class ones. I oftentimes think there's sometimes technology at play. And so 600 railroads in North America, a lot of the traffic owned by now 6 major class ones, they all have their own internal car distribution systems, which are mainly designed around their own system cars. You provide a 10, 20, 30% increase in private cars onto those systems that haven't really been re-optimized to handle that type of traffic. I think you're going to see downstream effects, especially if rail volume continues to climb in the way that is shown in years past that it has the ability to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's interesting, and that does lead to greater congestion that shippers see. And so maybe that's another question for you is, we have had, at least on the intermodal side, the volumes are down. I guess on the rail carload side, they're kind of mixed, sort of shows the industrial economy is in a better spot than the consumer economy. What are you seeing right now in terms of rail service? Has it gotten better than it was last year with some of the traffic coming off with, maybe some of these employee recruitment programs, increasing the employee count?
Yeah, great question. I think we'll talk quickly about volume first. Look, if you are a grain trader or you are dealing in minerals and aggregates, you're probably having a year, right? Those lines of business are certainly performing really well. Also, automotive for finished vehicles and automotive parts are also doing really well. What I think, as you pointed out, the goods that are moving a little bit closer to the consumer and are kind of delivering in that more, going off an intermodal ramp, maybe going final mile or to a distribution center. Look, it's having a tough time, mainly driven off of consumer demand. I think there have been some public earnings statements that the expectation for consumer demand probably isn't going to get any better this year. And so I wouldn't expect a ton of strength across intermodal. And I tend to split that out in a couple of ways, right? They've had 3 prior weeks of growth, but they've only been in the single digits. So I think when I think about intermodal growth, right, what's the import volume doing, mainly on the West Coast and potentially the East Coast? Don't see those going up nearly as high as we've seen in prior years. And as a result of that, the transloads over to domestic containers may not be as high as well. I think another item to watch is, especially related to consumer demand, is really around parcel or small package shipments. There's no sign that that's actually going to pick up anytime soon. And I think with the recent news around Shopify selling their logistics business over to Flexport, I don't know that there's a strong desire that e-commerce and package shipments are going to be improving over the course of this year. On to your other question around service. Service is 100% improving. Whether we're talking carloads, covered hoppers, center beams, intermodal containers, both international and domestic services, we are seeing lanes that are having 50, 60% improvement all the way from January to now. And in many cases, if you're an intermodal shipper moving in domestic service, most of the services that you're being offered right now, especially out of the Midwest, going to either the East Coast or the West Coast, you're likely beating availability that's been published to you probably by 12 to 24 hours.
Yeah, so that's encouraging. I mean, that seems to suggest, well, it's not an issue of intermodal service not being good like it was the past, let's say a couple of years where you couldn't get the chassis, couldn't get the containers, there weren't enough draymen, there wasn't the space in the yards in Chicago, there's all these problems. So if service has improved, it really seems like it's more on the demand side than the capacity availability side. And wanted to get your thoughts on a question that has been an issue of debate lately, really the last few years, not just lately. Is intermodal still a growth area? I mean, we have a sonar chart that shows a long-term trend of intermodal volume. Well, that's total rail carloads, but that's maybe another question where, okay, there's intermodal volume. Where is it a more accurate statement to say intermodal was a growth area or intermodal is a growth area?
Well, let's hold this chart up real quick, right? So going into 2019, you saw a consistent growth curve. 2019 slows down a little bit. I think if you look at some of that and you go back and look at inventory to sales ratios, there was kind of a dip in the overall inventory to sales ratio. So you had wider availability of goods, so maybe less need for transportation in that market at that time. Then you see the drastic drop off for COVID, right? That's not surprising to me at all. You see a bounce back in 2021 and a little bit in 2022. Why? Because over-the-road truck capacity was as tight as it ever has been. So I think the dip-off that you're seeing in 2023, well, I think we know what's going on with the overall truck market. I think trucks are widely available. Rates are generally cheap. I think seasonality and looking at where we are on the calendar with it being May 4th, we should see some tightening come online just historically as it's been happening with produce season. But I don't think it's going to be anywhere near what we've seen in years prior. So to answer your question a little more directly, do I still think intermodal is the growth engine for the broader freight rail ecosystem? Absolutely. Like, I don't think it's going away. Nationally, intermodal accounts for somewhere around 49% of all volume on railroads. Some have more than others. But I think that's going to be a continued area where they can continue to take share away from truck. the reality is service has to be in the right place, pricing has to be widely available and consistent, and in many cases, you're going to have to look at new service offerings for new areas where the population centers are changing and growing. If those three things happen, I think intermodal is here to stay, and it's going to continue to grow.
Yeah, all great points. I mean, you look at where the population is increasing and declining. It's declining in California and in Chicago area, right? I mean, right along the densest intermodal corridor, growing in smaller places or places that aren't so small in the south and southeast, southwest, et cetera. So I think that the network needs to change. How do you see the rail traffic evolving as a result of the CP KCS merger? And are you concerned about congestion in Houston? I mean, that's been a topic that's been brought up.
Yeah, good question. Look, I think the story has typically gone as one railroad sneezes, the rest of them get a cold. I think if you believe that, right, a rising tide should lift all boats. And so I think one of the interesting things is right after the CPKC agreement and the wider disbelief around intermodal service playing a prominent role in that offering, you see CPKC be able to sign up quite a few big names as it relates to domestic intermodal operations. And then you saw a competing service come right out with an agreement between UPCN and Ferromex. I think that competition is going to be good for the broader industry. And I think as it relates to intermodal service, I think everyone's generally tired of hearing nearshoring as being a trend, and they're all waiting to see the actual performance of what those lanes can do. I can tell you right now, there are a lot of smart people in Kansas City and Calgary and Montreal that are not going to be making those deals and are not going to be offering those services if there isn't volume and shippers lined up to create a really good market there. So I do think it's going to be healthy for the industry, and I do think from a NAFTA-related item, when you've seen imports and exports over the past decade, so 93 to 2023, I think they're up 500% and 800% respectively. Like, that's a growing market, and the only way it grows further is you have to have good, reliable service to be able to move goods across the borders.
Mm-hmm. And are there any revenue segments that you think are going to be most impacted by that merger? Ones that maybe are going to be more impacted than others. I mean, a lot of people have called out sort of intermodal. Some have talked about maybe auto, just because of that cross-border traffic. You have any thoughts on that?
Look, auto especially. I think that's actually been one of the really interesting items where you have finished vehicles making the trek across the border, parts making the trek across the border. I think especially down in the Monterey, Saltillo area. Look, there's a ton of opportunity. They've got an interesting labor force down there that is increasingly more skilled every 6 months. And so I think when I think about other areas that could potentially grow, when we talk about intermodal, I think CPG has an opportunity to grow there. I think we'll see some interesting electronic activity that's going on south of the border. But I also think some of the farming activity as it relates to cold stored refrigerated vegetables, I think will also be a really good opportunity to move across the border. I think what is going to be interesting is your broader aggregates and your bigger raw materials. Is there an opportunity for a large mining conglomerate to think about dual sourcing between maybe Mexico and Canada and leveraging that rail network with more reliable service? Maybe, potentially. I think that's absolutely something that those companies should be taking a look at.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it seems like it has the potential to impact a lot of different revenue segments, and it'll be interesting to see if it really has the intended impact of putting more volume on the railroads, because you do have that extended reach. So I'll definitely watch that closely. Be interesting. I also wanted to ask you, all the stuff that the STB is doing now. They put a lot of things on the back burner to get through the approval process for CS or the CP KCS deal. That's behind them. They have more capacity now. Any thoughts on what you think they're going to work on? What would be most impactful? Anything that you're concerned about them overreaching, maybe? Just any thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question. Look, yeah, there was a ton of brain power that went into that deal. Glad we have alignment and agreement and kind of how we're going to move forward as a broader industry. I think there are some lingering items that myself as a former railroader and our team have really been thoughtful around is what's next with reciprocal switching, right? There is there's a lot of lobbying in front of the board right now that is a potential solution to poor rail service or maybe even competitive access and competitive rates. I haven't seen an instance where that's yet been proven out, but I'll be interested to see how the board does make those considerations and actually do they believe are railroads able to maybe disprove that there is some net benefit for the shippers? I don't know. What I can say is that when you think about going back to a prior point that you made about how are you going to provide rail service to kind of some of these different areas of growth, well, if you think about the Port of Virginia, the Port of Charleston, the Port of Savannah, have all built rail facilities in their markets that are both dual served by Norfolk Southern and CSX. I think there's a lot to be said by having major industrial parks or facilities be dual served. I think that's actually helpful for a broader reach of the network. It's easier to get goods to new markets. But I'm wondering if there isn't an implication there where the closer monitoring of service levels by individual railroads may not create some sort of pressure that the STB may take a closer look at reciprocal switching.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they want to do something like. I mean, it seems like they want to do that, and they want to do the rate cases, streamline that, and it does seem also like they want to redefine or at least define in greater detail the common carrier application. So it does seem like there's a lot that they want to do to ensure that that service is better. You want to ask you about something that Joanna, you wrote the other day. You wrote an article about the California environmental rules. About maybe you can just describe that for us about moving to low emission, zero emission locomotives, and then Harris, maybe you could comment on whether you think that's possible at all by those timeframes.
Oh, right. Yeah. So the California Air Resources Board, I guess it was last week, it did decide, and it's been before the board for a few months already, but they did decide to focus on lowering locomotive emissions to the sense that, like, I think by 2030, like switching locomotives and then switching locomotives and I think some passenger ones. The locomotives have to be at least 23 years old or younger. I mean, at most 23 years old. And I think they're encouraging, sort of zero emission, if not zero emission locomotives, but some sort of like goal towards zero emissions. And then I think by 2035, it's that applies to sort of to the Union Pacific and BNSF. And I'm trying to. I don't know how much. Well, I mean, obviously, it is getting some pushback, but I don't know, whether there'll be legal challenges to that. I think one of the arguments is that, you have freight that's coming across from another state, and so how does that affect sort of like the interstate commerce, so to speak? So. But yeah, I mean that's kind of what's going on right now in terms of like California trying to really reduce locomotive emissions.
Yeah. So Harris, is that pragmatic at all? Because of the issue that Joanna brings up, that these locomotives obviously go everywhere, and then you have the cost of it, which locomotive now is what, $2.5-3 million a piece. How much is electric one going to cost? And then I don't know how you would recharge a locomotive. That sounds like that would take a week. So does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So let's take a look at the calendar, right? It's 2023. We're going to completely revamp the locomotive designs for 140,000 miles of track. I don't know that actually really makes a ton of sense, and I don't think you can actually meet that deadline in 7 years. I think the other question that really comes to bear, and I think this has been brought up by many of the OEMs as it relates to the trucking industry, those carriers, and even drayage providers out on the West Coast, is there infrastructure there, or will there be infrastructure in the next 7 years that will be able to handle, number one, not only just the demand on the electrical grid, but also where are you going to pull up all these trucks and plug them in and get them to charge, much less what it would take to actually do the same thing for an entire fleet of locomotives and the amount of locomotives that operate in and out of California every single day. I think that maybe the idea is that the railroads will somehow fix or design a system where they can bring their trains to the borders of California, switch locomotives, and then only operate zero emission locomotives inside there. I think we all know what that's likely going to do to the rail network and what that'll do to service times. And we're talking probably an additional 12 to 24 hours to simply just make those switches on a regular basis. I don't think that's a good decision for long term. I can tell you when I was with BNSF, the amount of times we had to think about the configuration of locomotives coming in and out of California, which were Tier 4 compliant. I mean, that was something we had to think about all the way when trains were originating in Chicago. So I think it's one of the items that I'm not sure is, it may be well-intentioned for the communities in California, but it may be poorly designed when we think about a broader supply chain. And I think if the past 2 years have taught us anything, supply chains are interconnected around the world. So a clamp or pressure or a disruption in one segment of it is eventually going to impact other segments. And so I think the encouragement I would offer here is we should always be thinking about the unintended consequences of changes that drastic in the supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you there. That was a really great insight, bringing your experience from BN. And unfortunately, this is all the time we have today. How can people reach out to you, Harris, and learn more about Telegraph and all the services that you offer?
Yeah, look, we are constantly rolling out new features. We actually just launched pricing last week. Proud of the team for that. You can always reach out to us at www.telegraph.io, and we will get back to you very quickly. Thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. We'll talk again soon.
See ya.